After around 2 to 3 years of lifting at the age of 17, I managed to deadlift 200 kilograms for the first time. Yes, sumo. Insert a joke about my sexuality. However, if you look closely, you'll notice something. My forearms aren't that big, and that's in spite of not using straps on anything for the first 3 to 4 years of lifting. Despite what people online said, just doing the heavy compound basics without straps didn't do my forearms justice. So I started doing direct forearm training, and I still do it to this day. The forearms are one of the most important muscles to make you look bigger day to day, since they're almost always on display. I'll be ranking exercises using these 5 criteria. According to ChatGPT, the most common forearm exercise is the seated dumbbell wrist curl, training wrist flexion. Just like the biceps and triceps make up the arms, the forearms can also be divided into 2 muscle groups. I'll crown the best exercise for each of these muscle groups at the end of the video. The larger muscle group is made up of the wrist flexors and grip muscles. If you're going to train any part of your forearm, this is the one to focus on for meatier forearms. The muscles that are responsible for flexing the wrist are frequently also involved in keeping a tight grip during a deadlift. The dumbbell wrist curl provides a double whammy for both. Not only does it allow for full wrist extension, getting a great stretch, you can also amplify this even further by letting the dumbbell roll into your fingers at the bottom and curling them as you curl. The exercise is plenty loadable, though getting dumbbells much over 60 pounds in the position can be a pain. It isolates the wrist flexor muscles very well with minimal spinal loading. Since you don't need to load a barbell, it's also time efficient. Overall, I'm of the opinion that the seated dumbbell wrist curl is the greatest wrist flexion exercise. It's a 9 out of 10 in all categories. Into S tier it goes. The seated barbell wrist curl is also great, but it comes with 3 downsides. First, you need to load the barbell, which can take some extra time to set up. Second, the barbell locks you into a great deal of supination, which can be uncomfortable for some people's wrists. And finally, between sets, if all you have is a 7-foot barbell, resting it on the bench is pretty difficult. High A tier. The second most common forearm exercise I see lifters perform is the standing dumbbell wrist curl. Unfortunately, I think this exercise is highly overrated. For one, you're adding stabilization and spinal loading into an exercise that doesn't benefit from it. For another, you're severely limiting the stretch emphasis of the exercise. There's no resistance to the bottom, and your wrist starts neutral as opposed to in full extension. Finally, the dumbbells actually rub up against your thighs on the way up, which is annoying at best. For those reasons, the standing dumbbell wrist curl goes into low C tier. Let's bash out the remaining standing wrist curl variations with a quick fire round. The barbell variation suffers the same limitations, but at least the barbell doesn't rub up against your thighs. C tier. The standing cable wrist curl is the best of both worlds. No thigh rubbing, and it's quick. Pick the weight and get going. High C tier. Before we move on to our final 2 contestants, let me tell you about how I've been consuming my creatine. Creatine gummies by Tasty Gains. I frequently forget taking my creatine when it's in powder form. It's just not top of my mind. However, since these gummies actually taste pretty good, I end up taking them more consistently than with the chalk aka powdered version. My favorite flavor is the mango pineapple flavor. Creatine monohydrate is one of the only supplements worth taking for more hypertrophy. I'll leave a link in the description if you'd like to check them out. There are a couple more options for wrist flexor hypertrophy. First is the wrist roller curl. It's a decent option, but few people have access to it. You can get a good stretch, although it's not a full stretch since you can't extend your fingers at the bottom under load. Likewise, it's not the most time-efficient option. Compared to a double alternative, you still have to load the plates. And finally, since you have to bend your elbows to 90 degrees, your biceps have to isometrically contract to keep the elbows in place, which might take away from forearm training. This could potentially take away from really hammering your forearms. The one thing the exercise offers plenty of is loadability, though other exercises offer this just as much. For those reasons, the wrist roller goes into mid-B tier. The hand gripper is another option. In contrast to the other exercises on this list, this one only trains the finger flexors and not the forearm flexors. Likewise, grippers are usually short and partials. You're capable of much more finger extension than the start of a finger gripper rep. If you're Scrooge McDuck, you'll have a variety of grippers at your disposal, allowing you to easily progressively overload. But for some, this will be an issue. This exercise does score favorably in terms of isolating the finger flexor muscles, and it involves minimal fatigue. But overall, this exercise is a case of little stimulus, little fatigue. It pains me to say it because they're fun little toys, but these go into low C tier. Arguably the best forearm flexor exercise is the incline dumbbell lift curl. By setting your forearm on an incline, you're hitting the point of peak resistance in the exercise in a more stretched position than you would otherwise. However, this setup does force you into training one arm at a time. Training forearms is already for the freaks. training one arm at a time will make this endeavor even less appealing. However, this exercise does score well in every criterion. So into low S tier, the exercise goes. MyoAdapt is S tier 2. Just like this tier list, MyoAdapt breaks down your forearms into forearm extensors and flexors, and make sure you're doing appropriate volume for both and progressing every week. Go to myoadapt.com now to register your interest. MyoAdapt is the smartest coach in your pocket. If you sign up when it launches, you'll receive both a free trial and a lifetime discount. The second group of muscles you want to target are the wrist extensors. Collectively, these make up a smaller fraction of your forearms than your wrist and finger flexors. But for maximum meat on your forearms, you'll want to train them too. Wrist extension exercises are basically the opposite of wrist flexion exercises. The same reasons that make a dumbbell wrist curl a good exercise make a dumbbell wrist extension a good one too. The same applies across the board. In fact, I'll throw up the equivalents on the screen now and rank them all at once. Take that, YouTube watch time. No fluff around here. A few notes on a few of these exercises. First, barbells tend to be a bit better for wrist extensions than dumbbells. That's because when you're using dumbbells, the dumbbells tend to slide around your hands during the set, oftentimes ending up completely vertical by the end of the set, which makes it very awkward. Second, supersetting a wrist flexion and a wrist extension exercise can work great for time-efficient forearm training. 4 studies suggest you'll build a similar amount of muscle but in far less time. However, you'll be substantially stronger for wrist curls than you'll be for wrist extensions, all else being equal. So, a good strategy is to use a higher rep range for wrist curls and a heavier rep range for wrist extensions, since that'll let you use the same pair of dumbbells. Whenever I talk about forearm training or bicep training, one of the comments will inevitably be no mention of the reverse curl. The reverse curl trains the elbow flexors, like any other curl. It also trains your grip muscles, because you have to hold onto a weight, although the weight usually isn't heavy enough to really do anything. Finally, it also trains the wrist extensors, and these will actually be pushed relatively hard. But wait, if that's true, why don't people do the barbell curl to train the wrist flexors in that case? Remember, the wrist extensors tend to be a fair bit weaker than the wrist flexors. So, while your wrist flexors won't be trained that hard during an underhand curl, during a reverse curl, your wrist extensors can actually be pushed pretty hard. But that doesn't mean the reverse curl is a good forearm exercise. For one, it scores poorly in terms of stretch emphasis. The wrist is neutral during the exercise. The reverse curl is more fatiguing than virtually any other wrist extensor exercise. The reverse curl is also usually limited by elbow flexor strength, not wrist extensor strength. So overall, for the forearms, the reverse curl goes into detail. The hammer curl is a similar case. While you could argue that some of the smaller muscles in your forearms get trained isometrically to keep your wrist neutral, it's unlikely these will give out first. The exercise ranks poorly in terms of stretch emphasis, target muscle emphasis, and stabilization required. So, into high detail it goes. Farmer's carries are another option people use for forearms. This exercise predominantly trains grip strength and finger flexor muscles. Plus, it's not as though the finger flexors or grip muscles are the largest in the forearms. The biggest limitation of this exercise is simply the amount of stabilization required and the fatigue generated. There's a large amount of spinal loading involved. The exercise scores poorly on all criteria, minus loadability. Purely for the forearms, this exercise also presents no advantage over a barbell hold, for example. Into low detail. The barbell hold is substantially better in terms of stabilization required and target muscle emphasis. However, it ranks pretty poorly in terms of stretch emphasis, how long it takes to load, since you often need to do quite heavy, not very time efficient, in terms of the stabilization required by other muscles, and there's a high degree of spinal loading as well. So overall, into C-tail. The dead hang is slightly better. It reduces spinal extensor loading, it's more time efficient on account of using your body weight, and if that's too light, you can do a one-arm hang. However, it still has many of the same downsides, and since you're only targeting finger flexion and grip strength, that means you're only targeting a small fraction of the forearm musculature. C tier. Finally, we have fat grip exercises. I don't have them on hand, but by making the handle thicker, fat grips let you train the finger flexors at long muscle lengths, which is likely a good thing. This also makes the movement more challenging for your grip and finger flexor muscles overall, which is probably a bad thing. Why? Since the finger flexor muscles are much smaller than the wrist flexors, but they can give out first when using fat grips, you can potentially sacrifice some wrist flexor hypertrophy for some finger flexor hypertrophy. So it's a bit of a miss the forest for the trees type of situation. They're not a terrible tool, they can have their place when you're trying to focus on finger flexor hypertrophy, but overall, not the best. Mid-beta. At this point, if you're watching this, I acknowledge that you're about 15 minutes into a video I made about training your forearms, which says as much about you as it does me. we're a rare breed.
Who cares about injuries? We're freaks.
I can just about afford one of these grippers. I can't afford fat grips. What makes you think I can afford stopping selling out? As such, you need an exceptional gym clothing brand, Rascal Apparel. Virtually everything you see me wear is by rascalapparel.com. If you made it this far into the video, you've earned your Rascal Apparel discount, code WOLF, which will get you 10% off your purchase and PayPal me some luck. As promised, here are the 2 best overall forearm builders. For the wrist flexors, I think you should span the seated dumbbell wrist curl. Honorable mention goes to the incline dumbbell wrist curl, if you feel like doing single arm work. For the wrist extensors, I think you should span the barbell wrist extension. Alternatively, if you carry a superset, the seated or inclined dumbbell wrist extension is just as effective. It can just be slightly awkward due to rolling at times. Milo Wolf, PhD, Popeye holds degrees. Until next time.